Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me today. This is video number 2 in a 11-part series on the French Revolution and Napoleon. In today's video, we're going to talk about some of the major issues that France was facing in the late 1700s that ultimately led to revolution. In the previous video, we talked about the estates system, the way French society was organized. That's certainly a contributing factor. The rest we'll talk about with today's video. All right, so as you take a look at what's on the screen there, note that it says in the late 1700s that France looked strong, but really was weak. Now we're going to identify really 3 categories or 3 areas of French weakness. But one thing to note, if you were outside of France at this point in time, and again, we're talking late 1700s, so think the last couple decades of the 1700s, your perception of France probably would not have been accurate. It was viewed as a wealthy, prosperous place by a lot of people in various parts of Europe and even various parts of the world. But looks can be deceiving, and that's part of what we'll talk about with today's video. So as far as identifying issues that France was facing, one was certainly not anything that most people would probably say was a negative thing, but it certainly posed a challenge for French society and how power operated in France, and that was the Enlightenment. In the previous video series, if you joined me for that, part of what we talked about was the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thought. This was a movement that developed throughout the 1700s especially, that among other things began to question the old ways of doing things. And so if you think in terms of government and government structure, the idea of absolute monarchy and a king that has total power and control, that was something that a growing number of people who engaged in these Enlightenment-related discussions were questioning, and you had a growing number of people who were beginning to think that there might be a different way to do things, a way that got more people involved with decision-making, something we would perceive as more democratic. Something else that's important to know about some of these ideas that were consistent with the Enlightenment, like equality and freedom and democracy, is the point where the revolution begins is in 1789. And if you follow your timeline, even though this isn't something that's necessarily been addressed recently for you, the United States had already formed at this point in time. If you think about some of the key events for the United States, you go back to the Revolutionary War from the 1770s and on into creating a new government, and then even by this time, creating a government under the Constitution that we're still under today here in America. So one thing these Enlightenment thinkers had at this point was not just theory and ideas that had the possibility of playing out in reality, but they had evidence from what was going on in America to say, look, it can be put into practice. Now, it was very early in its practice, but they, at least at this point, had evidence that it really could happen. So that was definitely a factor that would bring about some change in France. Now, economic problems probably represented the most concrete of the problems facing France, where when you become aware of some of the financial difficulties that France was in, it's not surprising that something big would end up coming of it. One of the challenges that was true in France is that due to debt problems that France had been in for many years before this point, one of the answers to try to solve those debt problems was taxation. And so many of the people throughout France were taxed very, very heavily. And when you look at growing and expanding, especially in terms of business expansion or starting new businesses, one of the things that can make that difficult are what are the costs involved with doing that. And taxes are simply a part of the cost of doing business. So if you have a heavy tax burden, that represents a heavy cost that may make it difficult to expand a business or may make it difficult to start a business. So not only was France experiencing a lot of debt, but in order to deal with it in the way they did their tax structure, it made it hard for new activity to get going, the kind of activity that might expand and grow the economy of France. Also, with taxes being simply a cost of doing business, they're also a cost of living. And so what it cost for people to just simply live in France was on the rise. And especially if you weren't necessarily making more money at the things that you did, yet your tax burden seemed to grow, it just got harder and harder for anybody to live well in France. And then there were even some things that were not the fault of anybody. The 1780s in particular were a bad stretch of time for agriculture. There was a series of bad weather years that made it difficult to grow the amount of food that they normally grew. And so regardless of anything else, there were some pretty significant food shortages compared to what was normal. And so that was challenging. And, at the end of the day, people need basic needs met. And if it's difficult to meet your basic need of having food to eat, that's a recipe for trouble. Now, again, speaking to the debt issue and connecting back with Enlightenment ideas that were being played out in America at this time, one thing that's also important to note about France's debt is one of the things that they spent a lot of money on just recently was supporting the Americans as they fought back against England in the Revolutionary War. Something that super helpful for us, but at least in the short term especially, was probably a bad deal for France. And so you put all those things together, and France was in real difficult financial shape. Even the best of leaders would have probably had a tough time dealing with some of the financial realities that France was in at this point. And that gets to the third area of weakness and challenge for France at this point in time, and that was leadership. The king at this time was King Louis XVI, and I suppose there's a lot of different things that you can say about him. He's probably a good example of one of the challenges of the monarchy system with hereditary right, where just the next person in line to be king, that's the person that becomes king, whether they're well suited for it or not, whether they desire to be king or not. It's not like they get put into that position because they've demonstrated good leadership abilities. And I think King Louis XVI is a great example of somebody who became king, who probably had no business being king, and as a result, his leadership did not help France at all. One of his challenges was just the ability to make decisions. He would seek advice, but basically what he always went with was the last piece of advice he got, whether it happened to be good or bad. So if you could be the last person to try to persuade him to do something, he was probably going to do what you suggested. So discernment was not one of his strong features. He also was married to a woman, Marie Antoinette. That was the queen at this point in time. She could probably be described as a professional spender. And when you consider the financial difficulties France was in, to have a queen who spent money on this, that, and the other for no apparent reason other than to just because she felt like it, that was pretty troubling and pretty difficult as a way of dealing with France's issues. And so as we get to the point where the wheels really get in motion for revolution, it really begins with Louis's decision to impose taxes on the Second Estate. We get into 1789. The financial challenges of France are getting so heavy that he decides, fine, I'll collect tax money from the Second Estate. Now, there ends up being a mechanism in place whereby the Second Estate can, in essence, challenge this and at least discuss this. And that's going to be the focus of the next video. So I hope you found today's video informative. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll tune in for video number 3. Thanks for watching.